Now, it's important that when we talk about immigration court, that we understand what it really is. Immigration court is actually a civil administrative type of jurisdiction. It's not a criminal jurisdiction. In other words, even though you may see people that are detained in immigration judges and immigration court overall, it's really more like a civil type of proceeding. And a civil proceeding where somebody is brought before a judge, somebody who is not authorized to be in the country, or may be authorized to be in the country but not authorized to work. That person is issued what is known as a notice to appear, and that is usually abbreviated as NTA. And that notice to appear basically is nothing else than a notice telling you to show up in court. When the notice to appear is issued and the person shows up in immigration court, then they show up because there are certain allegations against this individual. And the allegations always tend to be that the person is not legal in this country, or the person was working or was not supposed to be working, or whatever the case is. These are called immigration violations. At that point, the person who is given the notice to appear is known as the respondent. So the party there is the respondent, and that is the person who shows up in court. And the other party is the government, also known as DHS, which you may or may not know this, but DHS is the Department of Homeland Security. What does the Department of Homeland Security have to do with immigration? Well, when the law changed a few years or many years ago, the Department of Homeland Security was formed. The Department of Homeland Security was given different, responsibilities, or they were supposed to be checking certain things. And one of those things had to do with immigration. And of course, it could be other things they check that deals with people coming and in of the country, or terrorism and things of that nature. But as far as we are concerned, the Department of Homeland Security, when it is represented by an attorney there in immigration court, it's basically dealing with some immigration violations. So DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, which you will see the translations for this term when you go look at immigration terminology in letter D in this case, okay, which I don't recall exactly what page that will be, but you can look in your book. The first immigration terminology is letter A in lecture 1, but you can look for DHS. In fact, whenever I use any type of immigration terminology, such as respondent, government, DHS, please look at your class manual where it says immigration terminology, because that is already translated for you and explained to all of you what that particular term means and how that term plays a role in immigration court. So we have the government, which has a division called the Department of Homeland Security, that is in charge of immigration issues. So when you don't do what you're supposed to do as far as immigration is concerned, when you violate the immigration law, or also it's usually known as the Immigration Act. Act, as you may or may not know, is the same thing as law, no difference whatsoever. So when that person violates the immigration law or Immigration Act, that person is given a notice to appear. And that person is known as the respondent. Why? Because that person has to respond, to answer to all those allegations. What do you mean by allegations? Well, the entity that is supposed to regulate immigration here, which is DHS, represents the government. In other words, when you say DHS and the government, you're really talking about the same thing. The government is very, very big, but it has different departments. One of those departments is DHS. And within DHS, there's one division that deals with immigration. And that is so when we're talking about DHS in court, or when you're talking about the government, we're really talking about the same party. So it's important for us to keep that in mind in the translation. If you prefer to translate DHS the same way you will translate the government, it will be correct. But of course, when you have an entity or a department like Department of Homeland Security, the question is, when you translate that into your language, do you translate each word that it's in there? Or do you translate what the department does, which in this case is regulates immigration or controls immigration, or is in charge of immigration proceedings? Or do you leave it in English? What exactly do you do? Well, technically, you need to actually make a determination here. And you don't necessarily want to leave that in English unless that's the last resource. The bottom line is that we know now that DHS and the US government are the same. So if you don't want to translate or interpret rather DHS because it's complicated, that entity doesn't exist in your country, so it's very confusing, it's very easy. You can just simply say, transfer that as the government. So when you have then, so the parties then is the respondent, the one that has to respond to these allegations, and the U.S. government, represented by the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. Okay, and the translation is provided to you in your manual. I don't know in which lecture, but if you look at immigration terminology, if you look for letter D, you will find that translation, of course. So these are the entities. And why is it that, so when the person shows up in immigration court, the first time they show up, they basically show up for one purpose only, and that is to find out what the allegations are. And then you have to basically say whether you agree with those allegations or you deny those allegations. And you concede is another word that is used for agree, or you deny the allegations. If you deny them, you better have a reason why you're denying them. Or you better have some basis to stay in this country under the Immigration Act. What do you mean by that? Well, maybe you can say, well, even though I'm illegal in this country right now, I can't really go back to my country because if I do, I will be persecuted, either political persecution, it could also be religion persecution, it could be that you shouldn't have more than a certain number of children in your country. There's a limit as to how many children you can have. It could be because maybe a gang is actually looking for you in your country. It could be, for example, that the ruling political party is actually looking for you because you oppose that party. There are different cases, and they are all different. This really changes based on the country that you are coming from. But that type of, so what you're really telling the judge is, yeah, I'm illegal here, but look, I have grounds to be here because I can't return. That request is known as an immigration relief. And the translation for that, immigration relief, it's the same thing as an immigration benefit, really. And what it really is, it's just a benefit that you request from the government so that you can stay here in this country. And clearly that term, that particular relief that we're talking about here, is what you are telling the U.S. government, I'm illegal because of this, because if I go back, I could be killed. I'm in danger. I could be killed. I will be locked up forever, or whatever the case is. there's a humanitarian reason why I have to stay here in this country, because if I go back to my country, this is what could happen to me. And I don't want that to happen. I want to stay here. When you go to that first meeting with the judge, which, by the way, that first meeting is called a master calendar hearing. A calendar is just a list of all the cases. A hearing is just a proceeding before the judge. And a master calendar means the calendar of all the cases that are going to be heard that day, really. It's sort of the initial appearance, the first time that you see the judge. And although the judge is telling you that the government wants you out, you're saying, well, I shouldn't be out because I have grounds to file this request for a relief. And this is an immigration relief, okay? And the judge will then say, okay, if that's the case, we're going to have another hearing later on so that you can tell us why you think you can stay here. And a judge will make a decision. And it's not just you telling us. You have to find the basis. You have to show them that there are bases for you to stay. You have to show them if there is testimony. You have to bring somebody to testify. You have to show them evidence, because it's the burden of showing that you should stay in this country is yours, not the government's burden. So what actually happens in that second hearing is just similar to in a legal setting, is similar to a trial. It's just they decide whether you're going to stay, they meaning the immigration court, or you're going to leave, or you have to leave. Now, if they decide that you're going to stay, then that's perfectly fine. Now, of course, you will have an attorney because you have to file what they're calling applications, like, for example, an application for asylum. That type of application is going to be granted or denied by the judge, the immigration judge. That second hearing where you present all this evidence to convince the judge that you should remain here in the United States and be granted some type of immigration status so that you stay here in this country, that's called an individual merits hearings. So the way it actually all works, if you look here on the screen, starts with that NTA, which is the notice to appear. And then after that, you go to a master calendar hearing, which is MCH, master calendar hearing. Okay. And then after that master calendar hearing, if you tell the judge that you have some basis to remain in this country, then you're going to have an individual merits hearing. Now, in case this, you want to know some of the translations here, of course, for different languages it translates differently. You can translate the individual merits hearing as similar to a trial, an immigration trial, where they're going to make a decision. And the master calendar hearing is similar to what we call pre-trial. So this is like a pre-trial hearing, okay? And this is the actual trial. So you basically have the only thing that is different here compared to criminal matters, for example, or civil matters, is that you get one shot at the judge here and that's it. If you don't agree with the judge's decision, you can appeal it. But there is only one shot at that you have, one opportunity. Now, of course, sometimes they are postponed for various reasons. But in principle, technically you have one shot right there. You have to present all your evidence. What does it mean to you, the interpreter? Well, for us interpreters, you can expect a lot of people here, lots of people here. In other words, the master calendar hearing, you may be doing many cases. But in the individual merits hearing, you're going to be doing just one case with testimony, with all that. Because in the individual merits hearing, it's just like a trial, okay? And it is just exactly like a trial. So you need to bring your witnesses and all that. So for us interpreters, when we are in master calendar hearing, we see a lot of cases. But when we are in an individual merits hearing, you're going to see just one case. You will most likely know where the country where this person is coming from, what is the application that he filed, and that has to do with the basis that he or she is going to use in order to stay here, to convince the judge that he or she should stay here. And it also means something interesting in terms of what we call interpreting techniques. Okay, as you may or may not know, there are three types of interpreting techniques, three modes of interpreting. One is what we call simultaneous, which is you hear what the judge is saying in English, and you're interpreting into the target language, into the other language. We call the foreign language or target language. And as you hear what the judge is telling this person, you're interpreting at the same time. And sometimes the person speaks, then if they speak in the target language, you interpret at the same time, if it's just one or two words. The key thing here is that when that person, the respondent, is testifying, which is not going to happen in a master calendar hearing necessarily, it's going to happen here at the individual merits hearing. When the person is testifying, we don't use that technique called simultaneous. Simultaneous is only for master calendar hearings. And it is a technique where you hear and you interpret at the same time. And we're going to do some practices shortly so that you get a feeling of what it is. Now, in an individual, so that's the first technique, okay? Simultaneous. Now, one of the issues with simultaneous is the speed at which you are receiving, the interpreter, you're receiving the information from the judge. There is a big difference between a judge that speaks very slowly versus a judge that speaks very, very fast. The faster the speed, the more difficult it is for us to interpret. So what are the challenges here? Well, the challenges, of course, the first challenge I would say is vocabulary. So you need to know the proceeding. That's why in this training program, you're going to get scripts of all these proceedings so that you really become familiar with the script in English. So you will know what the judge is going to say. And that's the first challenge. So in the class manual, we selected keywords, and they are all translated into your target language. And you should know them. And of course, you should also know the criminal offenses, okay, which is part of lecture 1. Now, so the challenge is vocabulary, and the second challenge is actually speed. So the speed can be very slow. There are basically three speeds that we deal with: 130, 145, and 160 words per minute. Now, let me just give you an example of 130 is approximately the speed that I'm using right now. 145 is the speed that I'm using right now, approximately. And 160 is the speed that I'm using right now. So it's much faster, and it is more difficult to interpret, obviously. The faster the original is, the more difficult it is to interpret. Your online interpreting lab, when you go there, you're going to hear one proceeding, which it doesn't last more than 2-3 minutes. And it's going to be given to you at 1:30, then you can go to the next practice. It's going to be the same proceeding at 1:45 and the next one at 1:60. In immigration court, you should always assume that the judge will speak at 1:60 because the speed of the simultaneous in immigration court is very, very fast. We're going to look at techniques, how to deal with speed, and what to do when you don't know a particular term. We're going to look at that towards the end of the session today, or if not, in lecture number 2, depending on time constraints. But we are going to look at that technique, and it's going to happen either at the end of this lecture or next week. And it's important for you to know what you need to do when you cannot keep up with the original. And we also need to look at the protocol. What are you supposed to do when you cannot hear the judge? These are all things that you must know. They're part of your professional attitude, I usually call it. Okay, and you need to know what to do with it. So we're going to look at that in this training program, that's for sure. So that's the simultaneous, and this is, of course, used in master calendar hearings. Now, I will briefly mention what happens in an individual merits hearing. And sometimes it is abbreviated as either individual hearing, IH, or sometimes it's abbreviated as a merits hearing, MH. or sometimes individual merits hearing, IMH. What happens there is that there is testimony from the person who received the notice to appear, the respondent. And the judge wants to ask questions, or maybe the attorney for the government. By the way, the attorney for the government doesn't want you to stay here, because they are the ones that actually brought you to this court, or brought the respondent to this court, so that the court will officially deport you or remove you from the country. Well, the respondent has his or her own attorney, and what you want to do here is stay here in this country, obviously. And you may have some grounds that are very, very valid, like you're married to a U.S. citizen, so that's pretty straightforward. It's an application that's pretty straightforward. But if you don't have those grounds, there might be other grounds, like you're politically persecuted in your country, or gangs are actually looking for you, and if you go back, you have to show that your life is at risk. Your life and your family's life is at risk if you return to your country. In those scenarios, the judge needs to know why you think that your life will be at risk. So it's very possible that the respondent, very likely, almost certain, that the respondent will testify. And when the respondent testifies, the respondent speaks a language other than English. The questions are all asked in English, either by the judge, the attorney for the government, or by the respondent's attorney. So in those cases, you as the interpreter, you have to interpret that sequence of questions and answers. When you hear the question in English, you have to wait for the whole question to be asked, and then you interpret. So if the question is, for example, what is your name and what is your current address, you will have to start interpreting after you hear the word address. And then you say, what is your name and what is your current address? And of course, you will say that in your target language, in the other than English language. And then you will wait for an answer in the target language, which is other than English language. And you hear the whole answer, and then you will interpret into English. Well, that type of technique is called consecutive. And consecutive is mainly it's always used for testimony. And because really testimony happens here in an individual merits hearing, you can expect that technique to be used in an individual merits hearing. Now, we are going to see that in a lecture, I believe lecture number 3, or we even talk about individual merit hearings in lecture number 2. But what are the challenges of this technique consecutive? Well, the key thing here is to remembering, right? Remembering what? Remembering the original. What the question is, and then what the answer is. Does it mean that you need to wait for the whole answer and then interpret? No, there's a certain protocol that I will teach you next week, or when we talk about individual merits hearing, that deals with the consecutive technique and how you can have control of the whole situation. So we're going to talk about that. But I will also teach you techniques so that you can remember as much as you can. All right? So remembering the original is really the most difficult part of a consecutive technique. And you may say, well, there might be some vocabulary issues. Well, vocabulary, if nobody expects you to know every single word. But if you don't know a word, what are you supposed to do? That's called protocol. We're going to learn that as well when we look into individual merit hearings. So far we have 2 basic techniques: simultaneous, usually used in a master calendar hearing, and consecutive, usually used in an individual merits hearing. We have a third technique that is called sight translation. And this is a technique that you will not be doing a lot of it in immigration court necessarily. But it is a technique that you need to be tested. It is part of this course. It's part of the final examination, just in case you are asked to do a sight translation. And it may happen once a year or once every 3 years, but we need to make sure you can do that. What is sight translation? Well, when somebody gives you, the interpreter gives you, gives the interpreter, I should say, a document that is written, for example, in English, and then the interpreter is asked to read it in English and say it at the same time as you read it in English, you are saying it in the other than English language, in the foreign language, in the target language. So as you read this, you're saying it in the opposite language. Or it could be that this document that you're given is written in the foreign language. And as you read it in the foreign language, you transfer that into English. That's what side translation is. And we're going to see this particular technique later on in this training towards lecture number 5 and 6, I believe. Because it's not used a lot, but yet it's something that you have to be tested in case you're asked to perform this perform this type of technique. We need to make sure you know the skill, you have the skills. Now, what is difficult about this document? Well, it's reading and saying in the opposite language could be a little bit of a challenge, but generally those documents are written with very high level of the language. And it might be a document that deals with the rights of this respondent, or it might be a document that advises the respondent what's going to happen if he or she does not appear next time. There are different type of documents, so it may have a lot of legal terminology. That's why in lecture number 2, and that's not the only reason, but in lecture number 2 there is a criminal terminology or legal terminology presented to you in your class manual, because immigration court has a lot of criminal offenses and a lot of legal terminology, legal, criminal generally, okay? So those are the 3 techniques. Now, we are going to concentrate now on the very first one, which is simultaneous. Another way of saying it, we're going to look at what a master calendar hearing. So we already know what it is. Now, I want you to practice now. I'm going to play practice, and I don't want you to refer to your class manual. I just want you to hear it, and as you hear it, interpret into the opposite language, into the foreign language. If you can record yourself, it'll be great. So we're going to do this practice that it's a very short practice, a couple of minutes or so, and it is at 130 words per minute. So we'll do the practice first, then I'll come back and I'll give you more instructions as to what you need to do, and we'll proceed accordingly, okay? So now interpret using the simultaneous technique. And when you interpret while you're watching this lecture, you have to say it out loud. Don't interpret in your head, because there is a big difference between interpreting in your head, listening and interpreting in your head versus saying it out loud. What's the difference? Well, when you interpret in your head, the speed looks like it's not too complicated, but when you really have to say it out loud, then you really notice the effect of that speed, how that speed actually affects your performance. So I would like you to interpret it out loud. And if you have a way of recording yourself, it'll be just perfect. So I would assume you're also recording the interpretation. So I'm going to play what we call master calendar hearing, first case. Please do not refer to the class manual, and interpret using the simultaneous technique. Here it is.
Master calendar hearing at 130 words per minute. Case 332. This is a continued preliminary hearing before Immigration Judge Sandra Kim at Los Angeles, California on January 29, 2016. Case number A47-892-02332. So, what do we have here? Are you filing an I-130? The respondent was going to get married to a U.S. citizen 3 months ago, but the doctors discovered that the respondent's son has cancer, and the respondent had to go back to the respondent's birth country to take care of the son, who resides in there. Therefore, Your Honor, the respondent wasn't able to file an I-130 since the respondent did not get married yet. I understand that the filing was not made. but the respondent also has an asylum application on file. In the alternative, he does not file the I-130. That is correct, Your Honor. I will set for a hearing in about 9 months. If the I-130 works out, then I will be happy to look at an adjustment. What about November 18th, 2016? That is fine, Your Honor. Homeland Security? That is fine, Your Honor. You must come back on November 18th, 2016 at 8:30 a.m. If you fail to come back, I will hold the hearing and you could be ordered removed to your country of birth. Counsel, please make sure his fingerprints are up to date. Yes, Your Honor. The interpreter will hand you a blue form, a change of address form. Make sure you file that form within 5 days from your change of address. Otherwise, Homeland Security may arrest you. Any questions? Nothing further, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. Case is adjourned.
Okay, so that's the first practice you did with master calendar hearings without knowing anything about what it really is. If you recorded your interpretation, please save it. I'm going to tell you at the end of this session what you need to do with it. What I would like you to do right now is go to your class manual, and in the table of contents, you're going to look under lecture. Table of contents is on page 3, and you're going to look under lecture number 1, which says the first one, immigration terminology, page 6, master calendar hearings definition, immigration proceedings, master calendar hearings, and it says first case. I believe it's page 13. I want you to go to that page. That's going to be the script of your of the practice that you just did. And now, if you go to 2 pages after that, I believe it's page either 14 or 15, there's one part that says key terminology or terminology for first case. When you go to terminology for first case, you're going to find the translations of what we call key terms or expressions. The first one is, this is a continued preliminary hearing before Immigration Judge Sandra Kim. You have your translation into the opposite language. The second one that you have there on page, I believe, 15 is, are you filing an I-130? Then the word respondent, then an asylum application on file, and then I will set for a hearing and all that. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to play this again, this practice, and you will refer to that key terminology for the first case in case that was the hard terminology most likely. So when you hear it, then you have the translation there. That speeds up the process, okay? And of course, you will record yourself again, okay? So again, I'm going to play this again, but you can refer to the terminology, the translations given to you in your class manual, and you record yourself again, all right? So ready? Here is the practice again.
Master calendar hearing at 130 words per minute. Case 332. This is a continued preliminary hearing before Immigration Judge Sandra Kim at Los Angeles, California on January 29, 2016. Case number A47-892-02332. So, what do we have here? Are you filing an I-130? The respondent was going to get married to a U.S. citizen 3 months ago, but the doctors discovered that the respondent's son has cancer, and the respondent had to go back to the respondent's birth country to take care of the son, who resides in there. Therefore, Your Honor, the respondent was unable to file an I-130 since the respondent did not get married yet. I understand that the filing was not made, but the respondent also has an asylum application on file. In the alternative, he does not file the I-130. That is correct, Your Honor. I will set for a hearing in about 9 months. If the I-130 works out, then I will be happy to look at an adjustment. What about November 18th, 2016? That is fine, Your Honor. Homeland Security? That is fine, Your Honor. You must come back on November 18th, 2016 at 8:30 a.m. If you fail to come back, I will hold the hearing and you could be ordered removed to your country of birth. Counsel, please make sure his fingerprints are up to date. Yes, Your Honor. The interpreter will hand you a blue form, a change of address form. Make sure you file that form within 5 days from your change of address. Otherwise, Homeland Security may arrest you. Any questions? Nothing further, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. Case is adjourned.
Okay, so I'm sure this was easier because you have the translation, although I have to admit that sometimes when you're interpreting this technique simultaneously and you're looking at something, it's a little bit more complicated. But now you should have 2 recordings, one without you having prior knowledge of the script and the translations of the key terms, and then another one with the having knowledge of the script and also looking at the translations. So just a word of caution regarding the translations. These are suggested translations, and they are fine. They're perfectly fine, and if you use them, you'll be fine. But if you find a different type of translation, then you can use it provided that it conveys the same meaning, okay? That's very, very important to keep in mind. Now, what we're going to do next is I'm going to ask you not to look at the book now, the class manual, and I'm going to play a second case. And this time, again, you're not looking at it, and you record yourself as you're interpreting, okay? So here comes the second case. This is a second case dealing with a master calendar hearing. You have to use the simultaneous technique, and you're not supposed to be looking at your class manual, okay? Try to interpret the best you can. All right, so here it is.
Master calendar hearing at 130 words per minute. Case 279. Before we go on the record, the respondent has 2 children, right? Yes, Your Honor. What are their ages? 3 and 7 years old. I will waive their appearances for the next hearing. On the record now, Ms. Collins, does your client have an asylum application pending? Your Honor, the respondent prepared the application on her own and actually did a good job, but there are some typos, and I would hesitate to submit it today before I go over the application. Furthermore, I did not participate in the preparation of the application at all. You are now represented by Ms. Collins. It is not wise to do your own filings. You have to let your attorney help you and let her do the filing for you. You are paying her good money, and her job is to help you. I do have to admit that at least you had the initiative of preparing it on time. I will give you more time so that your attorney will have sufficient time to go over the application with you. Counsel, I cannot give you a date for about 8 months. There is a new policy that will allow you to file the application downstairs in the reception, and that filing will start the clock. But that is optional, right? Yes, it is. You can also submit it in the next hearing, if you prefer. Okay. What about October 21st, 2016? That works for me. It is fine, Your Honor. Also, I will waive the presence of the 2 children in the next hearing. You must come back on October 21st, 2016 at 8:30 a.m. If you fail to come back, I will hold the hearing and you could be ordered removed. Yes, Your Honor. The interpreter will hand you a blue form, a change of address form. Make sure you file that form within 5 days from your change of address. Otherwise, Homeland Security may arrest you. Any questions? Nothing further, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. Case is adjourned.
Okay, this was her second case, and as you can see, it's different, but there are certain things that are sort of similar. In general, some of these cases, there are certain minor modifications, and you can see that it doesn't have a lot of technical, complicated words. The ones that are technical and complicated, those are the ones that we highlighted in your class manual. So now I'm going to invite you, please, to go to your class manual. And in the table of content, which is on page 3, under lecture 1, you have immigration terminology, master calendar hearings definition, immigration proceeding, master calendar, first case, terminology for first case. We already did that. And it says second case. And then key terminology or terminology for second case. Well, I want you to go to that second case. I believe it's on page 17. And you can see the script of that practice. And then whatever has been underlined is what we consider to be the most complicated terminology. So that terminology is given to you on page 19 or translated to your language on page 19. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to have both pages 17, 18, and 19 handy and do this practice again, record yourself again. You do this practice using the simultaneous technique, but this time by looking at this terminology that is translated to you and looking at the script. Try not to necessarily follow the script that much, but yes, do look at the terminology as soon as you hear it, then you see what the translation is. Let's see whether you can actually interpret in simultaneous by only looking at the key terminology. As you can see, the key terminology for this case is, I will waive their appearances for the next hearing, and does your client have an asylum application pending? There are really only 4 of them. Just make sure you can refer to them while you're doing this practice, okay? So here's the practice again. Record yourself, please. Master calendar hearing, second case at 130 words per minute, simultaneous. Here it goes.
Master calendar hearing at 130 words per minute. Case 279. Before we go on the record, the respondent has 2 children, right? Yes, Your Honor. What are their ages? 3 and 7 years old. I will waive their appearances for the next hearing. On the record now, Ms. Collins, does your client have an asylum application pending? Your Honor, the respondent prepared the application on her own and actually did a good job, but there are some typos, and I would hesitate to submit it today before I go over the application. Furthermore, I did not participate in the preparation of the application at all. You are now represented by Ms. Collins. It is not wise to do your own filings. You have to let your attorney help you and let her do the filing for you. You are paying her good money, and her job is to help you. I do have to admit that at least you had the initiative of preparing it on time. I will give you more time so that your attorney will have sufficient time to go over the application with you. Counsel, I cannot give you a date for about 8 months. There is a new policy that will allow you to file the application downstairs in the reception, and that filing will start the clock. But that is optional, right? Yes, it is. You can also submit it in the next hearing if you prefer. Okay. What about October 21st, 2016? That works for me. It is fine, Your Honor. Also, I will waive the presence of the 2 children in the next hearing. You must come back on October 21st, 2016 at 8:30 a.m. If you fail to come back, I will hold the hearing and you could be ordered removed. Yes, Your Honor. The interpreter will hand you a blue form, a change of address form. Make sure you file that form within 5 days from your change of address. Otherwise, Homeland Security may arrest you. Any questions? Nothing further, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. Case is adjourned.
So now this second case, probably easier because you have the script. So now what you have in your possession are 4 recordings. For first case, one without looking at the script and the translations, and one with. And the same thing for the second case. What I would like you to do once this class is over, I will be teaching for about 6-7 more minutes, and then we're going to finish with the class. I'll tell you what you need to study and all that before you continue with lecture number 2. What I'd like you to do once we finish with this class, with this lecture, is for you to listen to all your 4 renditions. They are from English into your target language. And pretend that you don't speak any English and ask yourself, would I be able to understand this person or this interpreter? If the answer is yes, then you're in the right track. If the answer is no, you're going to have to practice and practice a lot. Okay? And I'm going to give you some guidance as to, even if the answer is yes, you should practice. Because after all, this was at 130 words per minute, which is rather slow. So we want to do 145 and 160. Now, what happens in simultaneous when you don't know a term? Well, in your final examination for this class, you will be instructed to skip the term and keep going. In other words, what you're trying to do is just interpret as much as you can from the original into your language. In real life, you can do the same thing, but if you don't know a term, you can interpret what you know, and the parts that you don't know, you can basically say, in your target language, of course, tell to the respondent, I'm sorry, but there was a word that I'm not familiar with. And then you continue interpreting with the parts that you do understand. The reason why we do this is because we want to make sure that the person that is hearing our interpretation into the foreign language, into the target language, to the other than English language, another way to referring to it, it's actually knows why you don't know certain terms, why you're leaving blank certain things, because the sentence will probably not make much sense when you don't know a couple of terms in that sentence. It'll be ideal if you can still come up with the sentence without adding anything, okay? Because you cannot add and you cannot omit. Now, sometimes we have to omit because we don't know the transfer, the term, how the term transfers into the opposite language. If that is the case, let the person know, I'm sorry, but there is a term that I didn't hear, or there is a term that I didn't know. Hopefully, it won't happen often. If you do all the practices in the lab, it shouldn't happen. If it is too fast, then it's because if you pass the final examination here for this course, then you will find that speed will not be a problem, because the final examination for this course is all at 100, and there's one at 145, I believe, but most of them are 160 words per minute. So in simultaneous, if you don't know a term, you skip, but you keep going. What you cannot do is just keep quiet and try to think about, how do I say that? Or look it up in a dictionary. You have no time, because you can look it up afterwards, but not while you're doing this. And a good practice is for you at the end of each of these interpretations to write down the term that you didn't know, so that you look it up and you know it for next time. This is a learning process, but you have to have a minimum requirement to be able to convey the meaning of what the judge and the attorneys are telling this particular respondent in the target language. Okay, the interpretation is into the target language, from English into the target language. So what are you supposed? So in simultaneous, that's what we're going to do. If you don't know a term, you can. If you know that if by skipping it leaves a very long pause and nobody understands, the respondent will not understand what you're saying, then just simply say, I'm sorry, but there's a term I don't know what it really means. But it conveys something like this if you have an idea of what it means. But I don't know the exact translation. And then you keep interpreting. You just continue interpreting for, the next sentence that the judge continues with. Then you continue interpreting. And if every time you come across a term you don't know, try to make the sentence so that the message is complete. You have to look at this from the point of view of the person receiving your interpretation. Does it make sense to me? Okay, and that's really the key element here. And if it doesn't make sense, why? So if you are saying, let's say the original is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you know how to transfer, to interpret 1, 2, 3. You don't know 4, 5, and 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10. So you will say in your target language 1, 2, 3, and then those 4, 5, 6 that you don't know, you will say, I'm sorry, but there are some words that I didn't understand. And then you continue 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? So that's the way to do this, if at all possible. Never stop talking simply because you don't know one word. Don't get stuck there. Never. That's the worst thing you can do. You may be disqualified. You need to be able to interpret this, say as much as possible. The fact that you don't know one single term doesn't necessarily mean that now you are not going to interpret the terms that you do know how to interpret. All right? Very, very important concept. All right, so what do you have to do before you take lecture number 2? All right, when you go to your class manual, you're going to find, let me just look for that. You're going to find in your class manual, okay, here we go. Under lecture number 1, you're going to find immigration terminology first on page 6. Starts with accompanying, and then adjust the status, administrative proceedings, and that is explained to you. This is in your class manual, and then the translation is given to you. Create flashcards with the term in English, and on the back the term in the foreign language, in the other than English language, and study them. You need to know those, and that's pages 6, 7, 8, 9. On page, so you prepare that and you study that. That's step 1. And you need to know the translation or the interpretation, but it's a good idea to also know what it means if you don't know what it means, what the term means, okay? On page 10 and 11, and I think it continues on 12, it's the definition in English of what a master calendar hearing is. And, there is a practice in the lab that is exactly like this definition, and you have to interpret. So one of the things that I suggest students to do is, as you are reading it in English, ask yourself, how do I say this in the foreign language, in the other than English language? So in a way, you're reading and you're thinking, how do I say this? So use this as a studying tool. There is a term you don't know, just look it up, highlight it, look it up, and create a flashcard. Then we come to the first case for master calendar hearing on page 13, and that is the script. And then on 15 and 16, you have the translations. You need to know those translations. And this may be single words, like on page 15, respondent, or it could be a whole expression. This is a continued preliminary hearing before Immigration Judge Sandra Kim. That's the first of those key terms. And respondent was the third on that page. So you create a flashcard and you memorize it, all right? And then you become really familiar with that term. You have to really know it right away. This is not like you see the term and you can wait 15, 20 seconds. No, it has to come out in a fraction of a second. And you repeat the same thing for the second case, okay? Then after the second case comes the criminal offenses. Starts with the word armed robbery, and it ends with voluntary manslaughter. It's a little bit over a page and a half. You need to create flashcards for those criminal offenses. One side of the flashcard in English, on the other side of the flashcard in the other than English language. And you need to memorize them. You need to know them, okay? So that's the first thing that you're going to do. Once you complete all that material, then you're going to go to your website, okay, which you can see here right now. This is your website, and you already went to the video lecture, obviously, because you're watching lecture 1. So once in the video lecture, once you finish, okay, you did lecture number 1, okay, so once you finish, you can always, and here's the course syllabus, by the way, and this is where you downloaded the course manual. Just return to the main menu, okay? After you study all that material, and go to the online laboratory, okay? Once you're in the online laboratory, okay, let me click here. Can I click here? It's got stuck. Okay. Once you're in the online laboratory, there you go. It's going to go now. You're going to see this. First thing you're going to do is click where it says click to download laboratory manual. You're going to have all the scripts for all the practices. You should refer to it after you complete that practice, not before, obviously. So look at what it says here. It says complete these practices after you finish watching lecture 1 and before you begin lecture 2. Well, this is lecture 1. You're going to finish in about 3-4 minutes. So then once you study all the material that I mentioned, you will go to the lab and you will do practice 1, 2, and 3. Number 1, 2, and 3, they are the same master calendar hearings, which are similar or identical to the ones that we did here in class. In fact, they are the same, but they are at 3 different speeds. So you do number 1, then if you record yourself, and if you feel you did very well on that, then you move on to 145 words per minute. That's number 2. And you don't move on until the next speed until you're sure that you can deliver at 145, and then finally 160. And you don't move on to practice number 4 until you can interpret at 160. And the best way to know if you can interpret at 160 is if you record yourself and you play your interpretation and you ask yourself, do I make sense? Basically. So you will have to do practice 1, 2, 3. Once you finish with those 3 practices, you can go to your to your laboratory manual that you download here, and you can look at the script for practices 1, 2, and 3. It's the same practice at 3 different speeds. But don't look at the script for practice 4, 5, and 6, okay? Then you go back and you do 4, 5, and 6. The same procedure follows. Once you can only move on to 145 once you interpret well at 130. Then you cannot move on to 160 until you interpret fairly well at 145. And you cannot move on to practice number 7 until you interpret fairly well at 160. Then you go to the laboratory manual, and then you look at the script for practices 4, 5, and 6. Then you move on to practice 7, 8, and 9, and the same procedure applies. And then 10, 11, and 12 is the definition of master calendar hearing, which is in your class manual, but it's also in your lab. So you can do all this practice at 130, 145, 160. This is going to be challenging. 10, 11, and 12 will be challenging practices because it has a lot of vocabulary. But it's not an actual procedure, it's an explanation, but it's a good way for you to see which words you don't know. If you come across a word you don't know while you're doing practices 10, 11, and 12, let's say 10, you don't know a term, stop the player, write it down, or look at the script already that you have in your laboratory manual for practices 10, 11, and 12, and when you don't know a word, highlight it if you want to. Then after you finish with 12, you look them up in a dictionary, those words, create flashcards, and memorize them. And then go back and interpret this sequence again. Okay? So the idea is that you don't move on until you can interpret the previous practice. You don't move on to the number 13 until you can do number 12. Now, I have to tell you that for 10, 11, and 12, if you will feel that it's very difficult, it's okay if you are unable to interpret 100%. 80% is sufficient. The other ones, practices 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, you have to interpret all of it at all different speeds, okay? Then finally, when you finish practice 12, you go to practice 13, and you're going to hear the criminal offenses, the ones that you have in your class manual that I just talked to you about after case number 2, the ones that I believe they are on page 20, I believe. It starts with armed robbery. That's the first term. Well, what you're going to hear when you do this practice is you're going to hear these terms and then a pause. During that pause, you have to provide the interpretation in the foreign language. So you're going to hear armed robbery and then a pause. That's the time you have to interpret that. Without looking at anything, you already studied them, remember? You already studied them from your class manual. So you shouldn't be referring to any notes or anything like that. And of course, if you don't remember one, write it down so that you review it and then you do the practice again. You cannot move forward you cannot watch lecture number 2 until you complete practice 13 and you know at least 90% of the terms. So there is a lot of work here, before you can begin lecture number 2. And keep in mind, you have to complete this training program within 10 days or so. So you have to put a lot of time. I think that watching in a 1-hour lecture, and it will take you an hour to watch a lecture, then it will probably take you about 3-4 hours to study the material, or 4 hours, that's 5 hours. And then the practice here will be another 4 hours. So you may be able to watch a lecture and study everything and do the practice in 1 day, okay? But you got to do it that way, so that way we are certain that you can move forward in this training program. All right, so this ends lecture number 1. Thank you.